September 20th, 1943. The train doors slid open with a metallic screech that echoed through the fog-shrouded morning at Buchenwald concentration camp. Among the hollow-eyed prisoners stumbling onto the platform stood Jean-Michel, a French resistance fighter who had been captured 3 months earlier. He did not yet know that he was about to become part of the Third Reich's most ambitious technological project, one that would claim 20,000 lives in the shadows of Adolf Hitler's collapsing empire. Michel and 1,500 other prisoners were loaded onto cattle cars and transported south through the German countryside. After 2 days without food or water, they arrived at a small town in the Harz Mountains called Nordhausen. What awaited them beneath the earth would make Dante's Inferno seem merciful by comparison. The SS guards herded them toward the entrance of an old gypsum mine called Kohnstein. The mountain had been hollowed out into 2 parallel tunnels, each nearly a mile long, connected by 46 cross galleries. This was Mittelbau Dora, though the prisoners would come to know it simply as Dora, a name whispered with the same dread as death itself. Inside the mountain, the temperature never rose above 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Water dripped constantly from the limestone ceiling, creating puddles that reflected the dim electric lights like pools of liquid darkness. The air hung thick with stone dust that coated lungs and throats, making every breath an act of defiance against suffocation. According to documentation later compiled by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, prisoners worked 12-hour shifts with minimal food rations consisting primarily of watery soup and a small piece of bread. The purpose of this subterranean nightmare became clear on Michel's first day. The prisoners were building a factory, not for tanks or rifles, but for Werner von Braun's revolutionary Vergeltungswaffe II, the V-2 rocket. These were Hitler's vengeance weapons, designed to rain terror upon London and Antwerp from the stratosphere, unreachable by any Allied defense. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, a cold-eyed architect of death who had designed the gas chambers at Auschwitz, now commanded the construction and production at Dora. Kammler viewed the prisoners as expendable components in his industrial machine, human parts to be used until they broke, then replaced. His deputy, SS Sturmbannführer Otto Fürchner, enforced discipline with methodical brutality. Prisoners caught resting were beaten with wooden clubs. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were dragged to the crematorium while still breathing. Michel was assigned to Tunnel B, where components for the V-2 rockets were assembled with precision that would have impressed any engineer, if not for the human cost. The rocket stood 46 feet tall and required 14 tons of liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel to propel their 1-ton warhead across the English Channel. Each missile represented the apex of 1940s engineering, born from the brilliance of von Braun and his team of scientists who worked in comfortable offices above ground. But von Braun's dream of reaching the stars was being built on a foundation of bones. March 23, 1912. In the affluent Prussian town of Wirsitz, a boy named Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun entered the world with aristocratic lineage and an imagination that reached beyond the clouds. His mother, Emmy von Quistorp, gave him a telescope for his confirmation, and the young baron spent countless nights mapping constellations, dreaming of the day humanity would walk among them. By 1932, von Braun had caught the attention of Captain Walter Dornberger of the German Army Weapons Office. At just 20 years old, von Braun was already conducting rocket experiments at the Kummersdorf testing grounds outside Berlin. His technical brilliance was undeniable. He could calculate trajectories in his head that took other engineers hours to work out on paper. When Adolf Hitler seized power in 1933, von Braun saw opportunity rather than ideology. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and later accepted a commission in the SS, rising to the rank of Sturmbannführer, Major. He would later claim these were merely pragmatic decisions, necessary evils to secure funding for his research. But the historical record tells a more complicated story. In 1937, the Army Weapons Office moved von Braun's team to a remote island in the Baltic Sea called Peenemünde. Here, with virtually unlimited resources from the Nazi war machine, von Braun assembled the greatest collection of rocket scientists the world had ever seen. There was Arthur Rudolph, the brilliant production engineer, Kurt de Boos, the launch operations expert, and Bernhard Tessmann, whose work on guidance systems made precision strikes possible. On October 3, 1942, von Braun achieved his masterpiece. The A-4 rocket, later designated the V-2, lifted off from Test Stand 7 at Peenemünde, climbing 53 miles into the stratosphere before arcing back to Earth 56 miles downrange. It was the first man-made object to reach space. Dornberger reportedly told von Braun that day, "We have invaded space with our rocket, and for the first time have used space as a bridge between 2 points on Earth." But Heinrich Himmler and the SS leadership saw something different in von Braun's creation. They saw a terror weapon that could break British morale and turn the tide of the war. On July 7, 1943, Hitler himself attended a demonstration of the V-2 at Rastenburg. The Führer, impressed by the destructive potential, ordered immediate mass production despite the astronomical cost. This decision created a problem. The Reich needed thousands of rockets, but Peenemünde could not produce them fast enough, and Allied bombers were already targeting the facility. Hans Kammler proposed a solution that merged industrial efficiency with genocidal pragmatism. Move production underground and use concentration camp labor. The prisoners would cost nothing. They were already condemned to death. Their labor would be free, their deaths unremarked. Von Braun visited Mittelbau-Dora multiple times between late 1943 and early 1945. According to testimony gathered during post-war investigations, he walked through the tunnels, inspecting assembly lines while prisoners collapsed around him. He complained about production delays and quality control issues. Whether he saw the human beings suffering to build his rockets remains one of history's most debated questions. January 15, 1944. The first completed V-2 rocket rolled out of Tunnel A at Mittelbau-Dora after 4 months of what could only be described as industrialized murder disguised as manufacturing. The production line that emerged from those blood-soaked tunnels represented both the pinnacle of German engineering and the nadir of human cruelty. Adam Kabala, a Polish political prisoner who survived Dora, later testified that the initial months were the deadliest. Before proper barracks were constructed, prisoners slept in the tunnels themselves, on bare rock floors without blankets. They relieved themselves in 50-gallon drums that were emptied once daily, and the stench of human waste mixed with limestone dust and machine oil created an atmosphere so toxic that many prisoners died from respiratory infections within weeks of arrival. The SS had established a quota system that turned human life into a mathematical equation. Each V-2 rocket required approximately 30,000 man-hours to assemble. With 12-hour shifts, that meant 5,000 prisoner days per rocket. The Reich wanted 900 rockets per month by summer 1944. The arithmetic was simple and horrifying. Prisoners would die, and they would be replaced. The only variable that mattered was maintaining production speed. Albin Sawatzky, a civilian engineer from the Damag Company, oversaw the production organization. He worked alongside Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's trusted colleague, to implement assembly line techniques borrowed from American automotive manufacturing. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. They were being murdered using efficiency methods designed by Henry Ford to build Model Ts. The V-2 assembly process was divided into specialized stations. In Gallery 4, prisoners installed the rocket's engine components. The combustion chamber had to be welded with absolute precision. Any flaw could cause the rocket to explode on the launch pad. SS guards beat workers whose welds failed inspection, regardless of whether inadequate tools or trembling, malnourished hands caused the defect. In Gallery 27, electrical systems were installed. This required delicate work with copper wiring and vacuum tubes. Prisoners with electrical engineering backgrounds were valuable here, but their skills only delayed their deaths rather than preventing them. Yves Bayon, a French prisoner who worked in this section, later documented in his memoir how prisoners deliberately sabotaged rockets when possible. A crossed wire here, a loose connection there. These small acts of resistance likely caused some V-2s to malfunction in flight, though proving cause and effect was impossible. According to records maintained by the International Tracing Service, an organization that documented Nazi crimes, approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora between August 1943 and April 1945. 20,000 died there, 1 in 3. The causes of death were systematically recorded by SS bureaucrats with chilling precision: exhaustion, malnutrition, beatings, hangings, and the catch-all category of natural causes, which meant anything the SS did not want to specify. The crematorium at Dora ran continuously. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside its doors, waiting for their turn in the flames. The ashes were dumped in a ravine near the camp, creating a gray deposit that locals could see from nearby hills. September 8, 1944. At 6:43 in the evening, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ada Harrison was preparing dinner in her home in Chiswick, West London. The sky was clear and peaceful. The Royal Air Force had achieved air superiority over Britain, and the Luftwaffe's bombing campaigns had ceased. The war seemed to be turning in favor of the Allies. Then the earth moved. A massive explosion erupted without warning, obliterating Mrs. Harrison's home and 2 adjacent houses. 3 people died instantly, and 17 were injured. There had been no air raid siren, no approaching aircraft, no warning whatsoever. Witnesses reported a strange double boom, one from the supersonic shockwave, another from the explosion itself. The British government immediately imposed a news blackout, claiming the explosion was caused by a defective gas main. But they knew the truth. Hitler's vengeance weapon had arrived. The V-2 rocket, built in the tunnels of Mittelbau Dora by dying prisoners, had just announced itself to the world. Over the next 7 months, more than 3,000 V-2s would fall on Allied cities. London received over 500 strikes. Antwerp, the crucial Belgian port supplying Allied forces advancing through France, absorbed thousands more. Unlike the V-1 flying bomb, which could be shot down by anti-aircraft fire or intercepted by fighters, the V-2 was unstoppable. It struck at 5 times the speed of sound, arriving before its own sound wave. The first indication of attack was the explosion itself. Reginald Victor Jones, the British scientific intelligence officer, who had been tracking German rocket development since 1943, understood the strategic implications immediately. In his post-war memoir, Most Secret War, Jones described the V-2 as a weapon that challenged fundamental assumptions about defense. If the Germans could produce these rockets in sufficient numbers, no city in Europe would be safe. Each V-2 carried a 1-ton Amitol warhead. The explosive yield was smaller than a typical air raid, but the psychological impact was enormous. Londoners who had endured the Blitz with legendary resolve found themselves terrorized anew by an enemy they could neither see nor stop. The randomness of the strikes, they fell day or night without warning, on schools and hospitals and homes, created a pervasive anxiety that Churchill's government struggled to manage. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence agencies pieced together information about where these weapons were being manufactured. Reconnaissance photographs of Nordhausen showed nothing. The factory was underground, invisible to aerial observation. Reports from escaped prisoners and resistance networks in Germany painted a horrifying picture of the conditions at Mittelbau Dora, but Allied commanders faced a grim calculus. Bombing the tunnels would kill thousands of prisoners, but failing to stop V-2 production meant more rockets would strike Allied cities. In the end, they focused on disrupting supply lines and targeting launching sites. The tunnels themselves remained intact, and production continued until the Reich's final days. Von Braun and his team worked frantically to improve the V-2's range and payload. They were developing the A-9, an intercontinental version capable of reaching New York City across the Atlantic. Had the war lasted another year, Manhattan might have joined London in experiencing rocket bombardment. April 11, 1945. The United States Third Army, under the command of General George Patton, liberated Mittelbau Dora concentration camp. What the American soldiers found defied comprehension. Major William Cowling, who led the initial scouting party into the camp, later wrote that the smell reached them half a mile away, a mixture of death, excrement, and chemicals that made hardened combat veterans vomit. Inside the camp, approximately 700 prisoners remained alive, though alive seemed too generous a term for their condition. They were walking skeletons, their bodies so emaciated that their bones seemed to pierce through their skin. Many were too weak to stand. The crematorium still contained partially burned bodies. The SS guards had fled 3 days earlier, but they had executed prisoners until the last possible moment, leaving corpses scattered throughout the compound. Captain Herbert Friedman, a German-speaking Jewish officer, conducted preliminary interviews with survivors. The stories they told, of the tunnels, the rockets, the systematic murder, seemed almost fantastical in their horror. But when American engineers entered the Konstein mountain tunnels, they found proof beyond any doubt. The production line stood complete, with partially assembled V-2 rockets still on their assembly stands. Tools lay where prisoners had dropped them. Blood stained the concrete floors. But the American Army had not come solely as liberators. They had come as competitors in a race against the Soviet Union for Nazi technological secrets. The initiative was called Operation Paperclip, though its innocuous name belied its morally complex mission: capture German scientists and their research before the Russians could claim them. Major Robert Staver, a rocket specialist with Army Ordnance, had been searching for von Braun for weeks. Intelligence reports placed the scientist somewhere in southern Germany, where the rocket team had retreated as the Reich collapsed. On May 2, 1945, Staver got his breakthrough. Magnus von Braun, Werner's brother, approached an American private named Fred Schneiker near the Austrian border. "My name is Magnus von Braun," he announced in English. "My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender to the Americans." Within hours, American intelligence officers were interviewing Werner von Braun at a safe house in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The 33-year-old scientist, his arm in a cast from a recent car accident, impressed his interrogators immediately. He was charming, fluent in English, and remarkably forthcoming about his team's capabilities. He had lists of where documents were hidden and where key scientists could be found. Von Braun understood his bargaining position perfectly. He knew the Americans feared Soviet expansion and wanted his expertise for their own rocket program. He presented himself as an apolitical scientist who had been forced to work for the Nazis, but whose true passion was space exploration. He barely mentioned Mittelbau-Dora or the prisoners who had died building his rockets. When questioned about his SS membership and his visits to the concentration camp, he claimed ignorance of the conditions and minimized his involvement. The American officers faced an ethical dilemma that would echo through decades. Von Braun was potentially culpable in war crimes. His rockets had killed thousands of civilians in Allied cities, and his manufacturing process had murdered 20,000 prisoners. But he also possessed knowledge that could give America a decisive advantage in the emerging Cold War. July 19, 1945. In Washington, D.C., senior military and intelligence officials gathered in a secure conference room at the Pentagon to debate a question that would haunt American conscience for generations. Should the United States recruit Nazi scientists who might be war criminals? The meeting was classified top secret. Present were representatives from Army Ordnance, the Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, and the State Department. Major General Hugh Knurr, Deputy Commanding General of the Army Air Forces in Europe, argued passionately for bringing German scientists to America. He framed it as a matter of national survival: deny these intellectual assets to the Soviets and simultaneously gain them for ourselves. But others were troubled. Samuel Klaus, a State Department official, raised concerns about violating the Potsdam Declaration, which specifically prohibited Nazi Party members from holding important positions. More fundamentally, Klaus questioned the morality of offering sanctuary to men who might have participated in crimes against humanity. How could America prosecute Nazis at Nuremberg while simultaneously recruiting other Nazis? The debate was settled by pragmatism and fear. The Soviet Union had already captured the Peenemünde facility and was interrogating hundreds of German scientists who had not escaped west. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviets were rebuilding Germany's rocket program under their own control. President Harry Truman advised that America's national security depended on technological superiority, authorized Operation Paperclip with the stipulation that ardent Nazis should not be recruited. That stipulation proved meaningless. Joint intelligence objectives. Agency officials, tasked with vetting German scientists, systematically sanitized personnel files. SS memberships disappeared from dossiers. Evidence of war crimes was omitted or minimized. Arthur Rudolph's extensive involvement in the slave labor program at Mittelbau-Dora was erased from his file. Kurt Debus, who had denounced a colleague to the Gestapo, was cleared. Even von Braun's SS rank was described as merely honorary. Between 1945 and 1959, approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to America under Operation Paperclip. They were given security clearances, American citizenship, and comfortable positions in the military-industrial complex. Their families joined them. Their pasts were buried. Von Braun arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas in September 1945, along with more than 100 members of his rocket team. They lived in relative comfort, working on American missile development while teaching Army engineers everything they knew about rocketry. The contrast with their victims at Mittelbau-Dora could not have been starker. While von Braun enjoyed Texas barbecues and discussed space travel, survivors of his production facility struggled with lifelong trauma and broken bodies. The French and Soviet governments repeatedly requested extradition of German scientists who had committed war crimes on their soil. The American government refused, citing national security interests. In 1957, when survivor testimonies about Mittelbau-Dora began emerging publicly, the Justice Department conducted a brief investigation of Arthur Rudolph, but concluded there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. The most damning evidence came from Albert Speer during the Nuremberg trials. Hitler's architect and armaments minister testified that V-2 production had been accomplished through systematic murder of concentration camp prisoners. He implicated Hans Kammler and other SS officials, but notably avoided directly accusing von Braun or the scientific team. Some historians speculate that Speer, who was trying to save his own life, avoided testimony that might complicate American recruitment efforts. Kammler himself disappeared in the war's final days. Reports of his death varied: suicide, execution by his own men, capture by the Soviets, or escape to South America. His fate remains one of history's mysteries, though his crimes were thoroughly documented. October 4th, 1957. The world changed when a beeping metal sphere no larger than a beach ball circled the Earth every 96 minutes. Sputnik, launched by the Soviet Union, humiliated America and triggered the space race. Suddenly, von Braun's expertise went from valuable to essential. Von Braun had spent 12 years in America, first in Texas, then at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. He had become remarkably Americanized. He joined the Episcopal Church, spoke with barely a trace of accent, and presented himself as the embodiment of immigrant success. He cultivated relationships with politicians, appeared in Disney television specials explaining space travel to children, and became a celebrity scientist whose face graced magazine covers. But Sputnik forced America to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Soviets, using captured German technology and scientists, had beaten America into space. The shame was intolerable. President Dwight Eisenhower authorized von Braun to develop an American satellite launch vehicle using an upgraded version of the Redstone rocket, itself based on V-2 technology. On January 31, 1958, just 119 days after Sputnik, von Braun's Jupiter C rocket lifted off from Cape Canaveral, carrying Explorer 1, America's first satellite. Von Braun became a national hero overnight. The New York Times ran his photograph on the front page, holding a model of the rocket above his head in triumph. The newspaper made no mention of Mittelbau-Dora or the 20,000 dead prisoners who had made his career possible. The 1960s belonged to von Braun. As director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, he led development of the Saturn V rocket that would carry Apollo astronauts to the moon. His transformation from Nazi SS officer to American space hero was complete. President John Kennedy visited Huntsville to personally inspect the Saturn program. Journalists wrote glowing profiles portraying von Braun as a visionary whose boyhood dreams of space exploration had finally found the right patron. But some survivors of Mittelbau-Dora were watching. Jean Michel, the French resistance fighter who had survived the tunnels, published a book in 1979 titled Dora, the Nazi Concentration Camp, where modern space technology was born and 30,000 prisoners died. Michel's account, based on his own experiences and interviews with fellow survivors, directly challenged von Braun's carefully constructed narrative. Michel described seeing von Braun in the tunnels, inspecting production lines while prisoners collapsed from exhaustion around him. He documented von Braun's complaints about production delays and quality issues, complaints that resulted in prisoners being beaten or hanged. Michel's testimony suggested that von Braun was not merely an apolitical scientist caught up in Nazi politics, but an active participant who prioritized rocket production over human life. Von Braun never publicly responded to Michel's accusations. In rare interviews where he was pressed about his Nazi past, he expressed regret for the suffering of war, but maintained he had no direct involvement in the treatment of prisoners. He claimed ignorance of conditions at Mittelbau-Dora, despite documented evidence of multiple visits. He suggested that as a technical expert, he had no authority over SS guards or labor practices. In 1970, as the Apollo program wound down, von Braun moved to Washington to serve as NASA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Planning. But his influence was waning. The public was losing interest in space exploration, and questions about his past were becoming harder to ignore. He resigned from NASA in 1972 and died of cancer 5 years later, on June 16, 1977. His obituaries celebrated his contributions to space exploration. The New York Times called him the father of American rocketry. Time magazine published a laudatory retrospective of his career. The 20,000 dead of Mittelbau-Dora were mentioned, if at all, as a footnote. Part 8. The Reckoning That Never Came. November 5, 1984. The United States Department of Justice Office of Special Investigations issued a report that would finally, decades too late, acknowledge the moral compromise at the heart of Operation Paperclip. The report concluded that Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's deputy at Peenemünde and production manager at Mittelbau-Dora, was complicit in crimes against humanity. Rudolph, who had received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal and lived comfortably in San Jose, California, was given a choice: face deportation proceedings and potential war crimes prosecution, or renounce his American citizenship and leave voluntarily. He chose the latter, returning to West Germany in 1984. He was never prosecuted. He died in 1996, maintaining until the end that he had no knowledge of prisoner abuse at Dora. The Rudolph case opened floodgates of historical re-examination. Journalists, historians, and survivors began systematically documenting what the American government had known about Nazi scientists, and when they knew it. The findings were damning. Declassified documents revealed that Army intelligence had detailed information about conditions at Mittelbau-Dora as early as April 1945. Reports explicitly mentioned slave labor, mass death, and the role of German scientists in overseeing production. These reports were suppressed or ignored to facilitate Operation Paperclip. The sanitization of personnel files was not bureaucratic error, but deliberate policy. Michael Neufeld, a space history curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, published the definitive biography of von Braun in 2007. Drawing on newly declassified documents and survivor testimony, Neufeld painted a complex portrait of a man driven by ambition who made Faustian bargains to achieve his dreams. Von Braun's genius was undeniable, but so was his moral culpability. He knew about the prisoners. He visited the camps. He complained when production slowed, knowing his complaints would result in harsher treatment for workers. He was not an innocent scientist caught in the machinery of Nazi evil. He was an integral part of that machinery. The legacy of Operation Paperclip remains contested. Defenders argue that Cold War necessity justified the compromise, that Soviet aggression was a genuine threat requiring America to claim every possible advantage. Von Braun's Saturn V rocket did take American astronauts to the moon. His Jupiter rocket launched America's first satellite. His technical genius contributed to American military and scientific superiority for decades. But the cost was profound. 20,000 prisoners died building von Braun's rockets. Their deaths were brutal, systematic, and preventable. They served no military necessity but rather Nazi Germany's obsession with vengeance weapons. Those deaths were then compounded by a second injustice. The men responsible escaped accountability, receiving instead honor, comfort, and American citizenship. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington now includes extensive documentation of Mittelbau-Dora in its permanent exhibition. Visitors can read survivor testimonies, see photographs of the tunnels, and learn about the V2 program's human cost. But the museum is notably cautious about von Braun personally. His role is documented but not emphasized, reflecting ongoing debate about how to remember a man who contributed to both humanity's greatest crimes and its greatest achievements. In Germany, the Mittelbau-Dora Memorial Site preserves the tunnels where prisoners died. Visitors can walk through the cold, damp chambers where V2 rockets were assembled. Names of known victims are displayed on memorial walls, though 20,000 names represent only the fraction that could be verified. Many prisoners died without their identities ever being recorded. They are remembered only as numbers in SS ledgers. So many dead per day, so many rockets produced. The question that haunts historians is ultimately unanswerable. Was it worth it? Did the advancement of space exploration justify offering sanctuary to men who participated in genocide? Could America have achieved its Cold War objectives without compromising its moral authority? Would the moon landing have been sweeter if it had not been accomplished with technology born in a concentration camp? These questions have no satisfying answers. History offers only facts, stubbornly resistant to moral simplification. The facts are these. 20,000 prisoners died building rockets. The men responsible were never punished. Those same men helped America win the space race. All of this is true simultaneously, and nothing can make it less complicated or less disturbing. On July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface, the world celebrated humanity's greatest technical achievement. But in the shadows of that triumph stood the ghosts of Mittelbau-Dora, asking whether the stars were worth the price paid by those who never lived to see them reached.